And we are live. Good morning to all of you who are on this side of the GMT. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on the time of the day that you're joining our session today, Caregiving in Print and Pictures. It is my absolute delight today to have our guest, Kate Washington, all the way from USA. Hi, Kate.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Welcome. So caregiving in print and pictures. Today's session is focused on perspective on caregiver burnout, its possibility, implications, and what might be some of the ways to cope. Could it be worthwhile for us to take a step back and say, why do we do what we do? So for all of you who are here, take a moment to look at this picture. What do you think is going on here? And who might be the caregiver? There are all kinds of circumstances and all kinds of stages and ages in which we are entrusted or we choose to be caregivers. And there are certain circumstances in which caregiving can mean many things. We have picked up meanings of caregiving from our socio-cultural environment and specifically from stories that are told to us both in print and in pictures. That governs a lot about how we see ourselves as caregivers, that governs how we address the task of caregiving and how we evaluate also whether or not we're doing a good job. A brief introduction to Caregiver Saathi, which is attempting to create an organization or an institution or a way in which they can be both human being for the primary caregiver. Family caregivers of those navigating terminal illness, chronic or other life-limiting conditions have unique challenges, and we support them during their caregiving journeys and beyond. Stories that we hear, both through print and pictures, can leave an impression and an expectation from us. This webinar series is about exploring exactly that and how might that influence us or how might that sometimes sabotage us. Caregiver Saathi wishes to create an environment of well-being by empowering the caregiver, where the caregiver feels they have choice of action, thought, and an ability to do things the way that they would like to do, so that both the caregiver and the care receiver can lead full lives. How do we do this? We live in a world where I am absolutely delighted, for example, today, to have with us someone like Kate, who is living miles away, but we can have a live conversation and we can share this conversation. So technology has brought the world closer, and being able to have a technology-enabled human connection is something that we would like to bring to the caregivers world. We do this by creating awareness programs that are both online and offline. This is essential because in the Indian context, a large number of people do not even associate or relate or identify as caregivers. On many occasions, many people would tell me, most likely we are the organization that provides caregivers. And very often I would have to turn it around and say, but I think you are a caregiver. So it's a question of awareness and taking on the role of caregiving that is absolutely fundamental in the Indian context. We do have a helpline where people can call in and ask questions or find out if that is possible for them. We have something called healing circles, in other words, support groups, which have hitherto not been very popular, but exist. And we would like to make them more commonplace than they are. Social media helps us reach out to many, many people, create awareness, create conversations, and build a community. Having the access to the right information is perhaps the biggest task today, although there is everything on the World Wide Web, and there is much access thanks to Google and other things. But what is the relevant information that one might need just about that much at this time can sometimes be a challenge. So having access to verified and relevant information only about that much that is required for decision making is something that we are trying to enable. We have a tech-enabled platform and an app that can help make the life of the caregiver and the people around them easier. There are some resources that we have built so far, which is our website, our app, and our platform. We have training programs that are both online and offline. We have an app that can help caregivers create the time and space for themselves. Very often we find caregivers say that, where's the time? Or, clearly in the face of the suffering of the patient, you might come last. So how can you create time for yourself? Build a community where you can together learn, share, and grow. And storytelling. Storytelling, not just listening to the stories in mythology that can sometimes be unreachable, or listening to other stories, but recognizing that every story is important. And this is really the genesis of this program as well, which is that caregivers are gentle warriors. And we would like to tell as many stories of as many caregivers as possible, not just in the light of their victories, not just in the light of their nobility, their achievements, etc., but also in the light of their struggles, and also in the light of all that makes them human, all that makes them relatable, and all that reminds us that although they are warriors, they are also human beings, and they are also going through their own challenges, which could be mine. And we do this storytelling through two formats. One is a video conversation with caregivers, and the second is a podcast. A large number of people, when I spoke with them, didn't want to be interviewed on video. So we decided to have a podcast, and this podcast, we listen to the stories of the caregivers, and we write them in the format of a diary entry. So imagine if we got a peek into the diary of a caregiver, a private conversation that the caregiver is having with a confidant, just so that we can get a peek into the life and the universe of a caregiver. Listen to our podcast, which is available on all platforms. Compassionate Caring is our webinar series that is conducted once a fortnight. These are learning spaces where you can join in and learn about caregiving, compassionate caregiving, that is compassionate not just towards the patient, but towards the caregiver as well. Caregiver Coaching is our program through which caregivers can learn how to build emotional mastery, endurance, resilience for long-term care. This is a one-on-one program, and you can sign up for getting individualized input and support, both for burnout as well as managing the environment, the stakeholders, not just the patient, but yourself, and the complexities that come in caregiving. Family counseling is something, illness in a family impacts everybody and can be worthwhile. So that's the other. And finally, a volunteer-based respite care program that many of us can sign up for or avail should you need a respite. There are many ways in which you can participate, which could be from the healing circles, the support groups, or helping us spread the word, share the caregiver stories, nudge people around you to tell their stories, volunteer with us, raise funds, encourage the youth to join our internship program. We also have an experienced program. Experienced individuals can join our fellowship program. Of course, there is a rigorous selection process for that, and our ambassador program, through which you can be an ambassador for our organization, for partners, hospitals, and other organizations where we can take the message of caregivers and caregiving in everyday lives. There is a framework of well-being and healing that we refer to. There are 7 elements of well-being, and at the very core is the physiological, psychological, and spiritual well-being. This is directed to us as individuals at the very core. However, we have an interface with the world. The interface with the world is the social well-being, the financial, legal well-being, life and work purpose alignment, and all of this in our creative expression. A balance in these 7 elements of well-being creates an overall balance for us, and stress is caused when there is an imbalance in these elements of well-being. Unaddressed chronic stress can lead to mental health issues, which include compassion fatigue and burnout. And building resilience is an act of everyday practice of mind, body, and soul. Today's session, we will spend about an hour having a discussion, and we will talk about the book today. Would request you to keep yourselves muted, and should your camera not be stable, please don't turn it on, else please feel free to turn it on. We will be recording this session and we are live on 3 platforms, Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn, and we will be referring to this discussion for designing further programs. With that, let me take a breath and introduce you to Kate Washington. So before I start what is on the screen, let me tell you this. We read about, many of us read about the book Already Toast on Washington Post or New York Times, and at least 7 people sent me a copy of that article from all over the world saying, here is a person you need to be in touch with. And it gives me goose flesh that something that was a thought, a wish, a desire only a few months ago is now a reality. So Kate is the author of the book Already Toast, Caregiving and Burnout in America. She's a freelance writer whose work has appeared in the New York Times, Time, Eater, Catapult, and many other publications. She holds a PhD in Victorian literature from Stanford University. Oh my God. Kate has a passion for developing recipes and is a food writer with 20 years of experience. My God, Kate, we need to have a separate conversation on that. She lives in Sacramento with her husband and 2 daughters. And with that, welcome, Kate.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I wanted to start by saying a few words about my book and my story. And since our theme is caregiving in print and pictures, and you spoke so beautifully about the importance of caregiver stories, I wanted to start by saying that I was a writer and a storyteller long before I thought of becoming a caregiver. And indeed, the first moment that I started to become a caregiver for my husband, though I didn't really know it at the time, writing was much more on my mind than caring for him was. It was, this was several years ago. It was the very first day of kindergarten for my younger daughter. My daughters were 9 and 5 at the time that I'm speaking of. They're 16 and 12 now. And on this day in September, so just about this time of year, my girls had gone off to school, and I thought, oh, I've made it. Like, the kind of caring that was on my mind was parenthood. And I thought, I'm going to have more time. My children are in elementary school. I'm going to have much more time for my writing, for my career. I'd been really focused on parenting. And on that day, my husband came to me in the kitchen where my little desk was, and where I was sitting down and thinking, oh, what creative project am I going to start? And he said, you know, I have these funny lumps along my jawline. And he's always worn a beard, so they weren't visible, but he was kind of pointing to them. And he said, do you think I should go to the doctor? And I looked him up and down, and he'd lost about 30 pounds over the preceding 6 months. And in fact, we'd been at a wedding earlier in the summer, and somebody said, Brad is so skinny. Does he have cancer? And I said, oh, no. Well, I said, yes, I think you should go to the doctor. It took about 6 months after that time to get a diagnosis for him of a rare type of T-cell lymphoma. It was a subcutaneous, so under the skin lymphoma. It was something his oncologist had never really seen before. they didn't quite know how to treat it. And so when I said, yes, I think you should go to the doctor, I didn't even realize that I was entering into a caregiving relationship with what seemed like my perfectly healthy, then 44-year-old husband. But I was. And that relationship intensified over time as the diagnosis came about 6 months afterward, and we went around and I went with him to appointments, kind of discussing with the oncologist how to treat, what he should do, because there was no standard of care for this very rare lymphoma. I was taking notes. I was calling the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society to learn more about blood cancers and about our options. And I also didn't really think of these actions as the actions of a caregiver, because again, my husband seemed perfectly independent. But I was contributing to his care. I was learning the ropes of being involved as kind of a partner and an advisor in what became a very intense journey of illness. And it really changed and shifted several months after his diagnosis. All of a sudden, we were sitting down to dinner one evening. By this time, it was May of 2015. So about 8-9 months after those first lumps. And we were sitting down to dinner and I heard him coughing from the bathroom. And he said, come right now. And he was coughing up blood. And so I grabbed a neighbor to sit with our daughters, and I got him in the car and I drove him to the emergency room because it was a lot and it was a terrifying moment. And in hindsight, I should have called an ambulance, but I drove and was with him at the emergency room. And that was the moment when I really plunged into much more intense crisis level caregiving. And those are kind of the two ways I would say that caregivers enter, either through the slow build where you're not really sure what's happening. That's a very common pattern, especially for elder care, where maybe a parent is having memory lapses and you're learning and seeing and thinking something's not quite right and pursuing a diagnosis, and you don't even quite realize that you're entering into the caring relationship as you go, or the crisis that dumps you straight into really intense needs from the ill person. My husband spent 17 days in the hospital after that event of coughing up blood. It turned out that he'd had a lung tumor growing that was undetected. His cancer had turned very aggressive. He needed urgent chemotherapy. That led to a collapsed lung. He came home on oxygen. He came home needing IV antibiotics administered through an external line. And I was very surprised to learn that the person who would be administering those antibiotics was me and doing all his line care. One of the things that many caregivers have experienced in recent years here is a real shift to doing much more highly medicalized tasks. And those can be really burdensome and stressful, and they certainly were for me. Brad's illness went on. He had chemotherapy. He relapsed very quickly and went into a bone marrow transplant in early 2016. And I was already pretty worn out from the cancer treatment and the intensity of his relapse, the emotional ups and downs. And I was feeling really overwhelmed, even when he went into the hospital for the bone marrow transplant. At the time, I was continuing to write. I stayed in a writing workshop. So I was working, writing often very raw, intimate kind of looks. When you spoke of the diary and seeing the diary of a caregiver, I thought of the work that I was doing at that time, but I really didn't have time for any of my freelance writing work or professional work because Brad's needs were high. We had 2 young children. We did have family help, which was an enormous support. But when Brad went into the hospital for that bone marrow transplant, neither of us realized that he wouldn't come out again for 4.5 months. And our daughters wouldn't see him for 3 months. He suffered really, really devastating complications called graft versus host disease. He had donor stem cells from his brother, which were a match, but there was still a reaction. And the level of reaction that he had, 90% of people who have that level of reaction don't make it. So he was very fortunate to survive. And after 4.5 months in the hospital, I'm sure any listener who has visited a loved one, who has been with a loved one and by their side in a hospital setting or in really intense illness can appreciate that I his parents, our support system, we were all wrung out by the time he was coming home. And that's when the doctor looked at me and said, you know, when he comes home from the hospital, he can't be left alone even for a minute. At that time, he had lost his vision. He had lost his ability to eat. He couldn't walk across the room unattended. So his medical needs were very, very high. And when he said 24-hour care, can't leave him alone for a minute, I thought, how can I do that? And in fact, I said it to the doctor. I was like, how am I supposed to do this? And he said, well, usually family steps in and it works out fine. And I was like, well, our family's already stepped in, like everybody's already had it. And the at-home care I knew was going to be incredibly, incredibly challenging. And indeed it was. And by the time he had been home for a few months, I was so burned out that one day I was in the doctor's office with him on a very hot morning. I'd already, taken the kids places. I had wheeled him. He couldn't walk, so he was in a wheelchair, and I'd wheeled him across the parking lot. It was 106 degrees Fahrenheit, so 40 some Celsius. And I just broke down in the doctor's office. I started crying. And that same doctor looked at me and said, if you can't take care of yourself, how can you take care of him? And I felt really almost attacked by that question, because it felt very much like the only point of me was to take care of him. And I felt like, don't I deserve care in my own right? Aren't I human? But I went home and I Googled, and I typed in caregiver, and I was thinking I was looking for caregiver support groups, or perhaps an organization like yours. And what popped up instead were search results for caregiver burnout. And there was a quiz, which I took. And at the end of the quiz, it said, you're already toast. And that phrase really stuck with me, because it was saying, you're already burned out. And I held on to that phrase, and I used it as the title of the book that I wrote, which was a huge part of my coping mechanism with the burnout that I was experiencing. I wanted to see reflected a story like mine, a story like the intensity of the caregiving that I was doing. And I wasn't finding that story. And that's really why I wrote the book, was to reflect back to caregivers how intense the experience can be, how much support people need, how much our systems are often failing us, and to tell that story and help caregivers know that they're not alone, that there are millions out there doing this kind of work, and everybody has an important story around it. So that's just kind of an overview of where I was and how my book came to be and how I came to tell this story. And I'll stop there, and perhaps we can now enter a conversation.
I'm so moved. Although I've heard this a little bit before, and yet every time I hear it, it moves me. And it moves me in a way that, it's not just your story, but the fact that you chose to integrate it with something that, could change the way some of this happens. It is around us that has been invisible thus far. We have a few people here with us who I know are very invested in not just reading and writing. And I think there are many parts of your journey that can resonate with some of the people here. We are so grateful that you were able to reflect back and convert your experience into a book. And this is precisely where we have some of the challenges in India. Mr. Murthy, please go ahead and keep would you like type your question, or would you like to speak up? If you would like to speak up, raise your hand and I will bring you into the conversation. A large number of people reach out to me that, when they search Google for caregiver support groups or caregiver itself, for us, a lot of people don't even look at themselves as caregiver. I was particularly moved by that moment with the doctor where you say, how am I going to do this? Just recognizing that this is going to be overwhelming and large can sometimes be a challenge, because oftentimes, I think women across the world, it's not just in India, are just expected to step into these roles more than any other. I would like for you to tell us about your experiences around being a woman in these in this circumstance, and whatever you may have seen around you.
Sure. I've often reflected and wondered what the situation would have been like had my husband's and my genders been reversed, had I been the one needing that kind of care, and whether the medical system would have expected quite so much and done so quite so unthinkingly. I think because for me, that expectation that the doctor had that I would simply work out how to provide 24-hour care, I mean, that's impossible for anybody to do on their own. Everybody needs to sleep and eat and take time for that. In the US context, which is obviously the context that I know best, about 2/3 of family caregivers are women, and the studies show that family caregivers who are women are doing more, are putting in longer hours and doing more grueling and more physical tasks. And I felt that that was reflected in my own experience and kind of what needed to happen. I always kind of suspected, but can't really prove, that if I had been a man, there would have been certain differences in how doctors and nurses assumed the level of care that I would be able to provide. There's one moment that I write about in the book. I did not change my last name. So my husband and I don't share a last name. And there was one moment that I found very galling where a young doctor in the hospital kept calling me Mrs. and my husband's last name. And I finally snapped and was like, that is not my name. You cannot call me that. And just the simple assumption that kind of subsumed my own personhood beneath his, when it wasn't accurate to my situation, felt very frustrating and felt like a real erasure of self. And I think that no matter the gender of the caregiver, that feeling of the self being erased, of losing who you are and what your needs are in the face of the really intense needs of the other person, the care recipient, is a common one. But I think that, as you suggested, that's often very unthinkingly assumed or presumed that women will simply provide and offer that. And so that, as I say, I don't have a contrasting experience of being a caregiver as a male, but that was something that I felt assumptions around gender and socialization really played into my experience.
Interestingly, I haven't changed my maiden name either. And I have many similar experiences where I'm often called by my husband's second name, and I wouldn't even recognize it often because I'm not used to being called that. I do experience that this gendered responsibility impacts both men and women in a very interesting way, in the sense that men are expected to continue providing financially because that's how patriarchal systems work. And, even if they wanted to care, they don't have if they wanted to be the primary caregivers, they might not have the flexibility for it because we have very few stories of men caregivers.
It's true. It's
Psychology, even in our everyday stories, even in films where the care recipient is a woman, the caregiver isn't a full-time caregiver. And the way our films talk about caregiving, they present women in a certain way. So I would like for you to talk to us a little bit about your journey where, I think it was a great point that you were expected to do some of the paramedical activities that you felt you were not adequately equipped for. So that learning curve, would you be able to talk to us about that experience and its challenges?
Sure. And that has become increasingly typical of family caregiving in the US context. The people are being discharged from the hospital with pretty high medical needs to get care at home. And this is obviously a huge cost savings for the hospital or for our insurers, most of whom are private companies. But it imposes really high costs on the family caregivers and entire family systems, kind of transfers that. And I did want to speak briefly also to the question of women in caregiving. The studies show in the US context that the economic burden of caregiving and of leaving work falls far more heavily on women. Women are much more likely to have to leave or reduce work hours. That was certainly the case for me, though I'm an independent worker and a freelancer. I did not have time to do any work on my own. So when Brad came home from the hospital needing IV antibiotics, the way it was communicated to me, I initially just kind of thought like, oh, they'll send a nurse for that. Well, no, he needed them 3 times a day. And it was a slow process. And they certainly couldn't send a nurse to do that kind of a skilled nursing task. So they had a contract service, like a traveling nurse who I had not met before, not the team that I was used to working with in the hospital. And this happened twice at different points when he was discharged from the hospital with different procedures that he needed. They had this traveling nurse contract service who spent maybe half an hour with me, and they had kind of dummy versions of the equipment and showed me how to do it and walked me through whatever the procedure was. And then I got a big, thick packet of instructions to tell me how to do it. And boxes of the equipment and everything that I would need, all of it kind of disposable, were shipped to our house by a contract service. So I didn't really have a clear point of contact for, once we're home from the hospital and at 10 p.m. that night and he needs the IV antibiotics and he has a PICC line in his arm that I know goes straight to his heart, and I'm terrified of introducing bacteria or an air bubble or something like that. And my hands were just shaking, and it's nighttime. I'm tired. I'm exhausted from him being discharged and transferring him home and all of these things. And I'm trying to remember like, okay, so I do this in this order, and I have to clean the end of the IV line with this tiny little alcohol rub and pad, and it became fairly routine for me fairly quickly. But this is a really high level expectation to put on family caregivers, and for me that was a relatively minor procedure, like to do it's IV push of antibiotics. So I was doing like over the course of about 5 minutes, a real slow drip of these intense antibiotics into his bloodstream. But as I'm sure you see often in your own context, caregivers are frequently asked to do wound care, to do diabetes tests, to do things to do with blood and bodily fluids, and really challenging levels of care that can be both traumatic and difficult for the caregiver, and also potentially quite dangerous for the care recipient. If a caregiver is not well trained, not confident, not up to the job, this is not good ultimately for the care recipient either, because they're not getting the level of care that they need. And that's no blame to the family caregiver. I instead look much more to the system that expects these medicalized tasks of people with no medical training or a few minutes of brief medical training. and very little support and guidance at home. And that, for me, I would say that that was the biggest shock of caregiving generally, was seeing up close just how much is being expected to be done at home, and you don't really have a choice. There's not really a point in the system where you can say, like, no, actually, I'm not comfortable with hooking my husband up to, later he needed IV nutrition on a pump every night, and it was like about a half-hour process to hook him up, and there were many points where it could go wrong. And I didn't really get a kind of moment to say, like, that's not really my job, or a job I would be good at. It was just like, learn it and do it. So that is a moment, I think, that and a challenge for many, many millions of caregivers that has really shifted over the past few decades.
Yeah, I mean, it's as you describe it right now. And I was just thinking about how that might be. So for some of the circumstances in India, I think the interplay would be a little bit about, first of all, a large amount of this care might happen in hospitals, or even if they were home-based care, then, some people might say that this I can't do, so this has to be taken care of in the hospital, but you might choose not to be in the hospital because, you might not have that kind of money to pay for hospital-based care, or hire a nurse at home who can provide this through your insurance plan, etc. So, you might need to step up for some of these things, and that can be quite something.
Yeah, and I'd like to add something I wanted to say. The higher level the tasks are and the more complicated the work of family caregiving, the harder it is for caregivers to get respite care or relief, because somebody else then has to be trained. Once I got comfortable with doing these tasks, it wasn't then easy to hand them off. And if they were daily or every few hours, then it prevents people from taking a break. And I think you see this in all kinds of contexts with family caregivers. This happens emotionally, for instance, with people with dementia. A caregiver may be the only one who knows how to soothe or calm down somebody when they become agitated. And these aren't easy skills to pass on. And it increases the likelihood of burnout, because it causes people to be that much more tied to care and feel like they're the only ones who can provide the care that their loved one needs. So that just adds an extra layer of challenge.
I love it, the way you speak about it so clearly. I think that's the biggest challenge, because I think it impacts caregivers also this way, that now I have figured this out. Now I know what to do. I've become more efficient. There could be, and I'm reminded of a few things in my home where, you just kind of do it a little mechanically because you've got the practice, and nobody else can step in for you because they are going to go through their learning curve.
Yeah, and that's also a danger, though, I think, because we can all take on the idea that we are the only ones, or that we are indispensable. And that makes it more difficult to ask for help when we need it. It makes it more difficult to accept help when it's offered. In the US context, the culture is very individualistic and very much privileges a kind of self-reliance, and especially also at the nuclear family level, which I think contributes to caregiving often kind of being done behind closed doors, or in being invisible to the larger culture. And it can be hard to admit when you need help and when you need to accept help. And I know these things are different across different cultures, but that's certainly a dynamic that led me to be probably more burned out than I needed to be, because I didn't reach out for as much help as I probably needed to ask for at an earlier stage.
I think you make a great point. And very interestingly, maybe the nuances are slightly different. And I just wanted to let Dr. Murthy know that I'm going to pick up your question in a bit. I have it. I think the ability for family caregivers in India also to be able to reach out for help for slightly different reasons, but is really not there. So, you are expected to just absolutely step in and be able to do a bunch of things yourself and figure it out. And there might also not be enough opportunities to learn or figure out how you want to balance your other things, like a career, like studies, depending on which age group you're in. So, everything else needs to take a backseat, because as a caregiver, especially as a woman, that has to be the thing. I wanted to just take a pause and say, so how is your husband doing now?
Oh, thank you so much for asking. He is 5 years on from his stem cell transplant, and he has continuing chronic illness of this type called graft versus host disease that's similar to an autoimmune reaction of the new immune system that he got against his body, the host. However, he is much more able to manage his own care. So he continues to be immune suppressed, which was a great challenge during the pandemic, though he has now been able to be vaccinated. He recovered his vision through surgeries. So that has been a huge change, but he's not able to work. He had to take a retirement from work, but he's functionally much more independent. So that has changed things a lot and has also made it much more possible for me to do things like write a book and be on a webinar and all kinds of ways, that have enabled me to tell my story and to talk with many other caregivers. And I recognize that for many caregivers, the duration and the intensity does not ease in the way that it has fortunately done for me, or often for many caregivers. Of course, the only end to caregiving is sadly grief and loss, which is presents its own, really grave challenges around telling and sharing the story, because then it becomes such a painful topic. So
yeah, that's totally another dimension. And but talking about your story and your challenge in writing a book, and you did say that you've been a writer and a storyteller anyway, and maybe that made it a little easier for you, or it just enabled it in some way, let's just say that. To reference Dr. Murthy's question and paraphrase it a little bit, it appears that talking about personal journeys, especially the challenges around caregiving, are rather hard because there aren't as many stories, as many. They are coming up in bits and pieces. And by the way, this is exactly what we will be doing. We will be featuring people who are talking about these in these webinars, but there's so few. It's a case of like representation. So for example, we say we want to see a particular gender represented, or we want to see a particular community represented. It's similar to that caregivers are just not visible because they're just not able to talk about their journeys. But you have been able to. What was that about? Could you talk us through that?
Yeah, so I wanted to talk about this story in part because I was so taken aback by the intensity of the experience. It was not what I was expecting out of that period of my life. And as I think I sort of alluded to before, as I was going through it, I started looking around for other stories to explain why I was finding it so intense and why I was finding it so difficult. And there are, caregiver memoirs out there in the US context, and some quite good books that are more theoretical as well. But I wasn't finding something quite like the book that I eventually wrote. And so in some ways, I feel like I wrote it to fill the hole of what I'd been looking for. What I wanted to do was not just tell my own story, but also include a larger cultural and social story about caregiving. And it focuses on the US context mainly, but it includes a good deal of research about the demographics of caregiving, the economics of caregiving, the economic and financial burden that family caregiving does place on families, and especially disproportionately on women, and even more so on women of color. I wanted to talk about, I was led to talk about the cultural impact. In part, you mentioned early on that I have a background in Victorian literature, an academic background. And so I actually returned to a lot of old favorite books, Jane Eyre, Middlemarch, things that I'd read when I was doing my PhD program and before, because I was always an avid reader, but classics that I'd loved. And I was reading those really for comfort and to return to old favorites when I was in the intensity of caregiving, because I couldn't quite concentrate on new to me books. And what I kept finding in those books was that there were caregiving figures all over them that I had never really paid attention to or really thought about their role in the narratives. And so the book, my book, eventually included readings of and analyses of those literary stories of caregiving to try to help explain a little bit of the cultural background of why we as a culture, keep caregiving invisible, what its importance is, the role of caregiving in the culture. So the book that I eventually wrote kind of brings all of these strands together to try to amplify it a little bit beyond just my own story. Though I think, every caregiver story is valuable, but I wanted to also tell a larger cultural and social story about caregiving as I was developing the book.
Yes, that's definitely a beautiful part of your book. And I'd like for you to talk about any two characters or any that you felt have been around. Let's say, all of us have gone through some of the books that you've mentioned, Jane Eyre, for example. Which are the characters or stories of invisible caregivers that you notice that you would, you speak about in your book?
Sure. Well, in Jane Eyre, I was one of the moments where I was really interested is actually there's a paid caregiver who takes care of Bertha Mason, the first wife of Rochester, who's hidden away in the attic. And that caregiver falls down on the job because she drinks too much and then she doesn't take good care, and terrible things ensue. But the attic moment I was very powerfully reminded of that one day when Brad was about to come home from the hospital, and I found out that we had bats in our attic, and I felt like I was losing my mind. Something about the nexus of those things all together reminded me of Jane Eyre. But there's also a moment later in Jane Eyre when the title character returns to Rochester, the man she loves, and he has been blinded in a fire set by that first wife, who the quote madwoman in the attic. And Jane comes back to him, and she very selflessly offers to be his eyes going forward. And I really wrestled with, when my husband lost his vision, he has, as I said before, since recovered it, but we didn't know if he would, because it was a very unusual complication that he lost his vision after stem cell transplant. And it was very uncertain whether he would ever see again. And I really wrestled with whether I could be selfless in the way that Jane was to be somebody else's eyes, because I also wanted to be my own eyes. You know, my husband is also a writer, and I didn't want to be the one reading for him always. I mean, we have technology to help with these things in a way that was not available in the Victorian era also. So it was a little bit more about the metaphor. But there's a similar tension with the character of Dorothea in Middlemarch, who I felt really strongly drawn to. She wonders about her duty in marriage toward her husband and the things that he's asking of her while he's ill. And so I was really just struck by and drawn to those two characters, but there are many, many others that I write about in the book, including contemporary novels, not just Victorian.
Yeah, I think, we end up reading some of this literature when we're much younger, and it has a way of settling in our unconscious in a way that, until you can have conversations about it, it cannot be peeled away. I mean, we have a large number of, stories from mythology that may impact. And I'm reminded of, there's a character from the epic Mahabharata in which the king is blind, and the woman who marries him decides to tie a piece of cloth on her eyes, saying that if my husband is blind, I will choose to be in his world. Mm-hmm. So Gandhari chooses to not leverage her eyesight to share the world that, and that's a story. Not that it's highly eulogized or glorified. It is not, thankfully. But the other story of saying that the wife or the partner steps in, sacrificing oneself for the sake of the other, is definitely a very popular narrative. So sacrifice among caregivers is definitely highly glorified. And with that is linked the next question from Sudeshna, which is that, it can be hard to ask for help. Sudeshna, would you like to ask your question yourself, or do you want me to?
Either way, it's fine. Hi, Kate. It's really nice to hear about your caregiving journey. And I was very shocked to hear the fact that you had to do a lot of the medical stuff yourself. Pushing the IV, that would have been a nightmare for me. So I was wanting to understand, would you have gotten any kind of medical help in terms of administering IVs? Had you reached out? Did you have that kind of a support system or anything else to kind of make your caregiving journey less stressful?
That is not really formally available in the US. So I should clarify about the IV, because my husband did have a central line. So it wasn't like I was having to insert a needle, which I think would have been too much and would not be something that they would ask of me. But I did at other times have to give him shots, have to check his blood sugar, various other tasks. And that what I found, and my research also revealed that this is becoming increasingly common in the US over the past 2 decades or so, is that these medical tasks have been outsourced to the family. And they do provide home skilled nursing visits once or twice a week. Like if somebody needs a blood draw, a blood sample, there was a period where Brad was too fragile to go into the lab as often as he needed blood work done to check levels of medications. And so for that, they did send a nurse to do blood draws. And I think that my understanding of this in the US context is that very definitely a failing of insurance and a function of cost cutting at both the hospital and the insurance level. You know, we have a very expensive and good if you can afford it medical system that is extremely inequitable. And I should add that my husband had and still has excellent insurance. He was an employee of the state of California and was unionized, and so had a very good insurance plan. So we had coverage for a lot of things, but the hospital stay coverage runs out at some point, and there's a huge push to discharge people, including quite fragile patients. You know, short of keeping him in the hospital, I'm not sure, you know, what they could have provided, or short of a paid nurse who was in the home, but with like nursing skills. What I learned is that attendant care, like 24-hour care if somebody needs attendance, is not covered at all by insurance. Our landscape is very complicated. So there are some Medicare situations where there is coverage for home-based services, and that's something that policy on is changing right now. But for the vast majority of people, it is not covered. And for me, the disjunction between a doctor telling me that it was medically ordered that my husband have 24-hour care, and then learning that there was no financial coverage for 24-hour care was quite shocking. And we ended up, fortunately, we had the financial resources to dip into savings and pay for attendant care, which was a huge help and probably saved my sanity and my marriage, to be frank. Like, I don't know what we would have done without the attendant caregivers, the paid caregivers that we had 24 hours a day for, I think, about 4 months until Brad was more stable. But it's a real bind for caregivers in this context, for family caregivers. And then it's a challenging landscape for paid caregivers as well. And I think the pandemic has only made that more the case.
Well articulated. And I'm going to be a little mindful of time. Thank you for your questions, Sudeshna. We have a couple more questions, and I'd like to somehow bring this conversation to a close. It is really late for you. And we are very, very grateful that we can actually have this conversation. And, you know, but at the same time, we'd like to give you the necessary rest. So
thank you.
Who has been your biggest support as you navigate this journey? I do think that in some form, the journey continues. I am actually very pleased to hear of your husband's recovery. It is a good thing. But I suppose some part of it continues. So who has been your support?
My in-laws were tremendous practical support during the intense phases of my husband's illness. And they did a lot, both in coming here to be with Brad in the hospital, and they are based in Canada. So it was no small thing for them to relocate for long periods of time to support Brad. I do have a strong network of close friends who, you know, I have a group chat that provided a lot of support and who's thanked in my book, and some dear friends who, you know, many not local, but my friend group and friends from all different periods of my life have been really important. My brother and I are very close, and he and his wife have been really important supports, and like would take the kids. And there was one family, and I just wanted to mention, we were really fortunate to have a strong like school community, and friends of my children's, and those families were supportive and really critical for parenting through this, because that was an aspect I haven't really talked about, but that added to the strain, because I was kind of solo parenting young children through much of this. But there was one family, and we're still good friends with them today, my younger daughter's best friend's family, and they have 3 kids of their own. And they lived near the hospital, and they just said to me, just bring Lucy every Sunday morning, 9 a.m., no questions asked, we'll take her all day. And that, not having to ask for that support, was, to this day, like, I'm getting chills thinking about how helpful that was, especially for her to have fun with a friend and not be in this house of sickness and stress. And I can never really repay them, but I do try to pay that stuff, that kind of thing forward. We got meals, we got a lot of support. So I don't want to leave the impression that I was just out there with nothing, because we did have a ton of community support, and it was still incredibly hard. And so I kind of wrote the book to say, like, this is impossible if you don't have support, and barely possible if you do.
I agree with you. It's heartwarming. Would you like to honor them by calling their names?
Oh, well, sure. The family's name is the Thurstons, who took my daughter. So, but there are many others.
I am sure they are. It does take a village. I do think that it's a village, not just to bring up children, but to look after the challenging circumstances that caregiving can offer. So thank you. And thank you to the Thurstons. So for the experience, it adds up somewhere. And I do think that it is hard for caregivers to reach out and ask for help. So it is helpful when somebody else just says, here's what I can do, right? And that's great. What I'd like to talk about is now going back to Dr. Murthy's question, which is that I do think that telling one's story around caregiving, especially as a woman, especially in environments where it is, the previous stories, like the story of caregiving that you mentioned, are embedded in our mind in a certain way, that's an ideal. How can we get more people to be inspired by you to write their stories?
I mean, in some ways, I think what it takes is the kind of work that your organization is doing to provide respite care, to provide recognition, to help people understand that they do have a story that's worth telling. One contact of mine here in the US, who's wonderful, her tagline around caregiving, or a thing that she says around caregiving, is that the caregiver is part of the story, part of the larger story of the illness of the family. And her website is called The Negative Space. I wanted to call that out. She does caregiver support, but I love that idea of honoring the caregiver story, but also I think in a very practical way, caregivers can't tell their story if they're so busy living it and so overwhelmed by living it that there's no space or time. So giving people even slivers of mental space, of time away, of time to reconnect with self. And sometimes telling the story, maybe telling it to a friend rather than writing it. Sometimes it may be meditating and reflecting on it and telling it to oneself to honor it before it can be brought to the world. But I think that is valuable too, and kind of speaks to your mission of giving people relief in all the kind of aspects of their life. I hope that answers the question somewhat.
It does. I relate to it personally. I am nowhere close to writing a book, but I do think that I have taken baby steps by being able to talk about my story in the way that I can talk about it, maybe with friends, maybe on webinars. I think it's a little bit of a journey to get to a book, but it's worthwhile taking those steps. So said. And thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for inspiring us. And thank you for being with us. And I hope that many, many people will listen to this conversation over YouTube or our recordings later. And we send you lots of love from this part of the world, you, Brian, the kids, and Thurstons and everyone else.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure to talk with you, to learn more about the the situation of caregivers in India and the work that you're doing to address that. So I really appreciate the invitation and this, what I think has been a really rich conversation. So thank you.
Thank you. You have a lovely night. And I'm just going to throw a wish out there in the universe to people like Sudeshna, Kamna, Dr. Murthy, Dishari, Shania, who are all here, that I hope to see their books.
Me too. Thank you.
Have a good night. Thank you all.